This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Tens of millions of Americans have already cast their vote for the next president of the United States, but they've also been deeply pessimistic about the future of our democracy throughout the race. At the beginning of the year, almost 4 in 5 Americans said the country was headed in the wrong direction. That may be one of the few things Democrats and Republicans can agree on these days. Will Americans be feeling better after November 5th? Coming up in this election special, we'll revisit our conversations with voters who'll decide this election, what motivates them, what scares them, what they hope for, and the issues that will decide our next chief executive. You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. We're recording a couple of days before November 5th, Election Day in the U.S. Soon, more than 150 million Americans will choose not only a new president, they'll also decide thousands of local, state, and national races. A lot is up for grabs, and no one knows exactly what's going to happen. And in this election special, we're not going to make any predictions or spend time dissecting who's pulled ahead at the finish line. We will use this hour to revisit our year-long coverage of voters who might decide this election, what motivates them, what scares them, what they're hoping for. We started our election coverage with a surprising fact. At the beginning of the year, almost 4 in 5 Americans reported feeling bad about the direction of the country, and almost 7 in 10 held unfavorable opinions about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. A lot changed throughout the year, most notably Joe Biden dropping out of the contest and Vice President Kamala Harris taking his place. But it's hard to tell whether American voters are feeling any better about where the country may be headed. Americans feeling bad. That isn't new. I've seen it for decades. But recently, I've been working on a democracy project that has taken me from large urban centers to some of America's most isolated rural communities. And I've noticed that same crippling mood of pessimism is everywhere. Name the issue. Public safety, unpopular foreign wars, immigration, the economy. It sounds like everyone's afraid of what might happen to this country if their candidate isn't elected. That's deepening the chasm between the two Americas. At this point, do people even believe our problems are fixable? Or are they convinced the country has simply lost its way? In January, I turned to Dante Cini, reporter, data analyst, and director of the American Communities Project at Michigan State University, to get to the bottom of these questions. I want to begin with the recent national surveys done for the American Communities Project. They ask a lot of interesting questions. What are the trends that you see in the data that might have surprised you or unlocked some things for you in trying to understand the country as we enter a campaign year?
I think a couple of things that jumped out of the survey were interesting. First, I think everybody knows the country feels extremely divided right now. But I was kind of surprised that we asked a series of questions about just basically agree, disagree questions, cultural questions, economic questions. And there was more agreement than I thought we'd see on some questions. A couple in particular about the economy is rigged for the rich. And everybody agreed with that question. Look, we have these 15 different community types we look at, and they're really different. They range everything from big cities and urban suburbs and college towns to rural middle America, aging farmlands. And the idea that everybody agreed on that question really surprised me. I mean, even places really that aren't winning, that are the winners, quote unquote, in the new economy, felt the economy was rigged for the rich. That was interesting to me. There was also something really fascinating, which was we asked people whether their lives were on the right track or wrong track, whether their community was on the right track or wrong track, and whether the country was on the right track or wrong track. Some of these communities are really struggling. They're having a harder time. They've got problems of opioids. They've got unemployment rates. Though unemployment's pretty good everywhere right now, but lower household incomes, places that look like they're struggling more. Everybody agreed, over 70, I want to say 75% agreed that their lives were on the right track. Every one of these places, even when lives look a little difficult in the data. And then everybody agreed that the country was on the wrong track. So again, these are places where they view the world very differently. Their economic circumstances are very different. And yet, on these two questions, is your life on the right track, wrong track? Is the country on the right track, wrong track? They were all in agreement. So the idea that everybody thinks the country's on the wrong track is strange, because how can that be?
To make sense of why Americans felt so bad, we turned to a voter who had just cast his ballot in the Iowa Republican caucus. It was the first presidential contest of the year, way back in January.
Presently, I'm working 3 jobs. I'm closing my business of 30 years, and my business went through a 1,000-year flood in 2008. I went through economic ups and downs before, but now, thank God I got my daughter through college, and she's out on her own and doing well that way.
Phil Hemingway lives in Johnson County, Iowa, the only county in the state where Donald Trump didn't take home the win. Nikki Haley won Johnson County by a single vote. Like many of his fellow Americans, Phil feels like the U.S. economy just doesn't work for people like him, no matter how hard he works.
In a time when I was hoping to kick back a little bit and enjoy the fruits of my labor, I'm working 3 jobs. It hits home for me, and like I say, it was a business that I had great success with, and it's just that this inflationary period has made it impossible to maintain it. And so now I'm working for other people.
While campaigning in Pennsylvania, President Biden claimed he's been better for small businesses than his predecessor was, and that, quote, everybody's doing better. It's just beginning to sink in. But this recovery hasn't trickled down in time to save Phil's auto and truck repair shop.
I'm chief cook and bottle washer of my shop, and really I'm kind of a dinosaur that way anyway, because most shops are multiple technicians and things like that, but I just always enjoyed working by myself and have done it my whole life. So I'm kind of clinging to a model that its days have passed. But the increase in borrowing money, the hyperinflation that I'm encountering with commercial property is killing me. And I'm not in a position where I'm going to kill my customers to keep myself afloat. If things come back and I can build or find something more economical to run my business out of, I'll open it up again. But right now, I've got to shut it down and sell off.
Inflation, high taxes, and a lack of opportunity has pushed this self-identified fiscal conservative to actively campaign for new leadership, someone that'll give blue-collar America and the workers like him a break.
Well, I spoke at my caucus, and the first thing I said is the most important thing is that we get Joe Biden out of the White House. I would prefer that we get someone new, because I think the problems that we're facing is going to take more than 4 years. It's going to take someone who has the potential of being there in the office for 8 years. And I don't think our country is well served by this constant flipping back and forth from the extremes, because it seems like there's nothing in the middle. So I really feel that we've got to get new blood and change the direction of our party and change the direction of our country.
But as the prospect of a Biden-Trump rematch becomes increasingly likely next November, Phil may have to choose between what he considers 2 very flawed candidates.
I've held my nose to vote before, and it won't be the first time. There's a saying that tough times don't last, but tough people do. And I've experienced tough times and things of that nature, and I know that that's part of life. It's part of growth. When I was younger, they said it adds character, but I feel I've got enough character now. We can laugh about it, but I think it's more than just saying it's just a blue period or something like that. I think there's some general cynicism with the system and with government and things like that. And we need some true leaders that aren't interested in their own personal gain or their own personal egos, and are true statesmen and work for the betterment of the people of our country, everyone, not just the elites and that, but the working class and all our citizens.
Americans from the largest urban centers on the coasts to the smallest rural towns are deeply pessimistic about the state of the nation. And on both sides of the political aisle, there seems to be a disconnect between what people want and where they feel the country's headed.
I think just the whole coarseness of our society has gotten worse as the decades go by, which is unfortunate, just in the language and the way people interact with other people. But I try to be optimistic. I try to look on the bright side. I think I went to my first caucus when I was in elementary school with my parents. So yeah, if you're not involved, you got no reason or right to complain. Because if you really want change, you got to be willing to put yourself out there.
During the campaign season, one of the most consequential and divisive issues for voters has been a woman's right to abortion services. While the state of the economy and immigration are top concerns for voters, abortion may be the single issue that tips the scale November 5th. So in March, we dedicated an episode to reproductive rights and how the controversial Dobbs decision impacts women across the U.S. Roe v. Wade was overturned on June 24, 2022, and for the past 2 years, Americans have watched as the long arm of the Dobbs decision has grasped long-held reproductive freedoms, and we're already starting to see the far-reaching consequences. In Alabama, where the future of in vitro fertilization was recently cast into doubt, the Alabama State Supreme Court ruled in February that fertilized embryos are considered children, and the judge in the case cited Dobbs repeatedly. In the weeks that followed the Alabama ruling, IVF clinics were thrown into chaos as they tried to figure out what this meant for the patients' futures. Our producer Elise Manukian spoke with a woman in Birmingham, Alabama, about how her family has gotten caught up in this decision.
I remember watching the news one day after Roe v. Wade, and I remember, I can't tell you who or what, but I do recall like reading that, IVF could come under attack. Did I ever expect that it would happen to me? Absolutely not.
Her name is Latorya Beasley. She's a therapist, originally from Huntsville. Latorya and her husband had their first child together through IVF last year, and now they're in the midst of the process to have their second one. Here's Latorya.
To be honest, sometimes Americans, we can be a little spoiled. We know things are happening, but until it happens to us, it may not affect us. And I don't want to speak for all Americans, but I think that's how I was living my life. Oh, yeah, it could happen, but surely it won't happen to me.
When Latorya Beasley conceived her first child through IVF in 2022, she planned it out to a T.
I was like, so type A. I used like Google Forms, and then it like moved over into an Excel spreadsheet of like my days and the different symptoms that I had.
But when Alabama's Supreme Court decision came down in February of this year, Latorya wasn't sure what this would mean for her current IVF care.
I'm in a small group for women who deal with infertility and different losses and just getting pregnant. So the Tuesday following, we kind of started to discuss like what that would look like. And there was like a lot of anxiety just amongst ourselves.
The next day, Latorya went back to her IVF clinic, Alabama Fertility.
That Wednesday, I had a doctor's appointment. My doctor came in immediately, and I could tell. I knew something wasn't right because she normally comes in and she's like just upbeat, but she didn't have that same upbeat. Like, it was almost forced. And that's when she told us like, hey, I don't know what's going to happen, but right now we're moving forward, business as usual, but things could change. So I actually had my husband on the phone. And when I left out of the appointment, I asked him, I said, hey, what'd you think about that? And he's like, I think she's being extra. I don't think anything is going to happen. He said, and even if it did, it wouldn't impact us. I mean, you've already started medicine. Those were his words exactly. And I was like, I don't know, babe. I'm feeling a little uneasy about it.
Leaving the clinic that day, Latorya went to go pick up some medicine. As she's pulling away from the pharmacy, she heard on the radio that the University of Alabama at Birmingham, which is the big hospital in the state, was pausing its IVF treatment.
And I knew then. I said, all it's going to take is one person, one clinic to start the snowball effect. And with UAB being the largest hospital in Alabama, smaller clinics will definitely follow.
So to understand why the clinics were pausing, it's helpful to know a bit about how IVF works. You might have heard about test tube babies. This is how they're made. An egg is retrieved from the womb and combined with a sperm in a lab to create an embryo. And then one or more of those embryos is implanted into a patient's uterus. That process is called an embryo transfer. The embryos that don't get used are frozen and stored. If patients don't need them or if there's something wrong with the embryo, they're often discarded. That's why Alabama's Supreme Court ruling was so controversial and why it affected Latorya. It meant IVF providers, as well as patients who seek out the treatment, could face criminal charges if anything happens to the embryos, even if something happens by accident. Unfortunately for Latorya, all of this legal confusion caused her to miss a critical window.
One of my girlfriends that's in a small group with me, we are like neck and neck with our transfers. She just did her egg retrieval. And so throughout this process, we've been like, have you gotten your date yet? Have you gotten your date yet? My transfer was scheduled for March the 4th and hers was scheduled for March the 11th. So she actually got a call from our facility early in the morning telling her that you're still in the clear. I just took it as that would be the same thing for me. Well, come to find out, I got a call later on that afternoon, and I couldn't tell you what the girl said. She was just like, I'm so sorry. I just blanked out. I was sad. Initially, I was just devastated. People just don't understand the emotional, financial, physical effects that it takes to go through the process. This is money. Every time I go to the doctor, it's a $30 copay for monitoring fees. These are essentially all of these appointments that I've had leading up into this were really for nothing. And, emotionally also, you kind of have this vision in your head of like, if it works out, I'll be pregnant this, and then I'll have a due date of this. You start to live like this imaginary world of what ifs. And that was what I wanted. Unfortunately, it didn't plan out that way, but it's what I wanted, and it was what I wanted to work towards.
That's the sad irony of all of this. In an effort to protect children, even ones that haven't been born yet, Alabama's Supreme Court ruling was actually making it more difficult for families to conceive. Since 1987, more than 1 million babies have been born in the U.S. through IVF, according to Pew Research. Frequently, it causes families to have twins or triplets, which is even more babies than they were expecting or hoping for. So, isn't IVF the pro-life choice? A Republican senator from Alabama, Tommy Tuberville, was actually confronted about this by a reporter from MSNBC.
That's what the whole abortion issue is about. So
this really isn't about abortion. It's about IVF and the concern that now families might not have access to it.
But it's about the same direction. But I agree. But people need to have access. People need to have. We need more kids. We need the people to have the opportunity to have kids. I'd have to look at the entire bill and how it's written. I have not seen it.
Supreme Court decision.
Well, I know that, but I'd have to look. I haven't looked at it. But this is state issue.
Women aren't going to be able to have IVF treatments already in some places.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
What do you say to them?
Unfortunate.
Latorya watched this awkward interaction unfold on the news.
I was like yelling at the TV the whole time I saw one of our great senators have that answer that question. It was like, what? That doesn't make any sense.
Latorya and other IVF patients and providers protested the ruling at the state capitol. But the one thing she won't do is leave Alabama.
That is the thing that makes me cringe the most. If you want to get me aggravated, tell me to leave and go get treatment somewhere else. You will see a different side of Tori, because the reality is I am a normal, average American, and most average Americans cannot just up and leave in the middle of the night to just go and receive treatment hours away. Like, that is so unrealistic. I live here. I live in Alabama. I pay taxes in Alabama. All of my support system is in Alabama. I just feel that I deserve to have access to healthcare in Alabama. My clinic is less than 10 miles away from me. Why should I have to go to wherever? Because the reality is I'm surrounded by Republican states, so it could happen there. I don't even know where I would go, to be honest.
Alabama has since passed a new law granting IVF providers immunity from the court's ruling. Latorya's clinic was able to resume services. And on Monday, March 25th, she went to see her doctor.
This morning was my mid-cycle testing, and so my ovaries are clear and everything is progressing the way it should. Endometrial lining is nice and thick, and my doctor did, after lab testing, did say that we could go ahead and proceed with a tentative transfer for April the 8th.
This should be great news, but Latorya knows she still has a long road ahead.
I would like to say that I was excited, but I wasn't. You're happy. You're like, okay, one step closer. Let's just get through the next hurdle. Let's just get through the next hurdle, and then we'll be happy. And so realistically, I know that even after we transfer, the embryo will be put in, but then the next hurdle will be, let's just sustain it. And then you want to get to a heartbeat. And once you get to a heartbeat, you want to, in our mind, we say, well, once we get out of that first trimester, we'll feel more calm. The reality is I know I likely won't. You'll always have that worry, but my goal is to just be as present as I can, to enjoy each day, each step.
And even though clinics and doctors are supposed to be protected, Latorya isn't sure the new law goes far enough. Because the law doesn't address fetal personhood, the question at the heart of the ruling. That leaves the door open to future challenges.
The bill or the law that was written into place, it did not actually address personhood for the embryos. We're in an election year. Depending on how this election pans out, everything could be uprooted again.
For now, Latorya and her family got an okay from the doctor to go on vacation after her transfer date. She and her husband are taking their 1-year-old daughter to Disney World. She found out there's actually a lab where she can get her testing done inside of the park, so Latorya can continue her treatment from the happiest place on earth.
That story was reported by our producer, Elise Manukian. Latorya's story caught national attention in the weeks following the Alabama Supreme Court ruling. She was invited to share her experiences at a roundtable with Health Secretary Xavier Becerra, and then was invited to be a guest of First Lady Jill Biden at the March State of the Union address. In the president's speech, Joe Biden actually mentioned Latorya by name.
What her family had got through should never have happened. Unless Congress acts, it could happen again. So tonight, let's stand up for families like hers.
Latorya said it felt good to know what was important to her was also important to the President of the United States. You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, once November 5th is done, there's only one thing we're all going to be talking about: who actually won. But if the polls get it wrong again, is it time to rethink how we predict presidential elections? If you missed any part of this episode, or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. I've covered presidential campaigns since the Reagan administration, and accurate polling has been a growing challenge all during that era. And as our tools have improved, John and Jane Q. Public have become more elusive. Back in the 80s, pollsters reached American households via landline telephone. This method was reliable because relatively few homes had access to more than one phone line or call screening. Technology was scarce, so people also used to answer unknown numbers. Political scientists could relatively accurately map registered and likely voters. But the proliferation of cell phones changed everything. Today, because of call screening, it's grown exponentially harder to get voters to answer a call, much less to get them to answer how they're feeling about the election. Pollsters are also using online surveys to take a measure of the electorate, but these results are especially unreliable because it's easier for people to not be honest. As of this recording, the polls say the race is a virtual tie, a true toss-up, and it's anyone's guess who will win on Election Day. Democrats don't want to believe it, and others don't believe any of it.
It's looking like Kamala Harris, after the first debate, is up about 3 percentage points in national polls. Do you trust those numbers?
Absolutely not.
You don't have to look hard to find people who are skeptical these days. About everything. They don't trust cops, politicians, Supreme Court justices, people like me, journalists, who talk about all the things people are skeptical about. But the one thing we all want to believe in, are the numbers. The data, the certainty that the candidate we choose, who we're on the sidelines rooting for, will deliver on their promise for a better version of America. Except for Samaya Garza.
There's never going to be a way for them to make it 100% accurate, because the reality of it is you don't know what's in someone's head on election day.
And Samaya would know. She's 24, works as a legal clerk at a law firm in Detroit, and she's one of a few 100,000 voters, maybe less, that will decide who wins the presidential election in November. We are 49 days away from the election. Who are you planning to vote for?
That's a very good question. I have not decided on who I'm going to vote for, and don't get mad at me, but if at all.
Samaya is weighing her options, but not between the two current candidates.
I don't have to list the reasons as to why I don't want to vote for Trump. I'm a Mexican, Muslim, American, so woman. I'm not exactly his favorite or his target demographic.
This is the second time she's been able to vote in a U.S. presidential election, and that she's considering not doing it at all says a lot. Samaya grew up in Qatar. She went to a high school started by a former U.S. ambassador, took all sorts of classes about politics, and loved watching American news.
I actually watched the 2016 election in Georgetown University in Qatar with the American ambassador there. We had to leave to go to the university at like 4 a.m., I want to say, in the morning. And there was this room where we all sat in, and surprisingly, in the Middle East, a lot of people did support Trump. So it was an experience.
But 4 years after casting her first ballot in 2020, Samaya is doing some soul searching.
I voted for Biden, and I regret it. I essentially just voted for not Trump. So that's really why I voted for Biden. He was just the other option. He was a placeholder. And then after October 7th, it just solidified to me that, okay, well, both of them suck.
To be clear, Samaya is referring to Israel's military response to the October 7th attack by Hamas, not the attack itself.
And while I understand that October 7th, it was horrible, I think that this unconditional and unwavering support that he's given to Israel, I don't agree with it. Meanwhile, we have a bunch of issues in our country that we haven't been able to solve, and he's sending billions of dollars overseas. It comes down to is that I'm tired of having the blood of other people on my hands. That's why it's taking me so long to make a decision, because it's a big decision to make.
Samaya says her friends have been trying to convince her to vote for Vice President Kamala Harris, but that her mind, it isn't easily changed.
I felt very guilty for voting for Joe Biden, and I don't want to feel that way again if I put my trust in Kamala Harris, because I did put my trust in Joe Biden, and that didn't work out. I feel almost betrayed by our former president, where I don't want to have that feeling again and feel like I regret voting for someone this time around. I think that if Kamala Harris were to take accountability for the egregious charges that she's imposed and sentences that she's imposed on people in the past and her time as a prosecutor, and acknowledge suffering that Palestinians have been enduring for the past 80 years, I would vote for her. I just want her to be open and honest with us. Not be a hypocrite, not tell us what we want to hear, tell us what you actually believe and what you actually want to implement.
Who do you think is going to win?
That's hard to say, but from the people, I've been in school with, from the people that live in the building that I live in, people have a lot of support for Kamala Harris. So if I were to gun to my head to say, who do you think would win? I think it would be Kamala.
When you've got a gun to your head, sometimes you just got to make your best guess. For On Shifting Ground, I'm Mateo Schimpf.
Whether we can trust the polls, that's how we'll end this election special, because now that we're at the finish line, we need to answer the question, with all the surveying and number crunching, are our predictions any better than the flip of a coin. As newsrooms shrink, data coverage increases. Running the results of somebody's poll is easy, doesn't require much staff time, and gives the illusion of campaign coverage. At the same time, the public's trust in data research, in public opinion research, appears to be declining, and not just being wrong, but really, really wrong in some key races hasn't helped. Before we've even had the chance to catch a breath, we're leaping from the world of nonstop polling to the world of forecasting, odds making, betting markets, and they're even harder to credit in a fluid, long, changing electorate than the straight-up question, who are you voting for? Have opinion researchers and data scientists managed to keep up with the way the country has changed? And now that there are so many companies, universities, news organizations, campaign consulting firms in on the game, what's an A-plus poll versus a grade C poll anyway? And what in the world is a betting market? Justin Grimmer is a political science professor and senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. He's the 2022 co-author of the book Text as Data, a new framework for machine learning and the social sciences. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks for having me.
Is this obsession, this day-to-day following of election forecasting, still a pretty new thing?
It is certainly new within the framework of American political campaigns. So the obsession with forecasting really started in 2008 when Nate Silver first started making his forecasts. And what was remarkable about 2008 and then in 2012 is that he was able to perform seemingly well on those forecasts, selecting Barack Obama to win both of those elections. After that, people really started to pay a lot of attention to these forecasts, and we saw a real proliferation of these forecasts across different news outlets.
But when you say people started to pay attention, there was a very interesting thing. As someone who covers campaigns and listens hard to what people say about them, I had people say back to me, wow, that was crazy. That was so out of line. Nate Silver said she was going to win with 88%. There was a very basic understanding of what a forecast model was and what it was telling you about the shape of a race in the last days of a campaign.
There's a real risk of confusing two different quantities that an election forecast could give us. One quantity it could tell us is the probability of someone winning. And I believe in 2016, Nate Silver had Hillary Clinton having a 60% chance of winning the election. Quite separate from that is the vote share that someone would expect to receive. And Hillary Clinton having a 60% chance of winning is very consistent with it being a razor close election. And just one more, I think, really important point is it's hard to know what exactly that 60% from these models means. Usually, when we teach statistics, we would say that 60% would mean if I ran the election 100 times, 60 times Hillary Clinton would win, 40 times Donald Trump would win. But of course, we don't get to run presidential elections 100 times. We only get to run the 2016 election once, and we're only on our 60th presidential election in U.S. history. So we're still pretty far away, I think, from having those probabilities make much sense.
When you run the numbers, and I often hear data scientists referring to running the numbers or running scenarios, what is it that you're feeding into a computer, and what are you asking those numbers to tell us?
Yes, anytime you hear someone say running the numbers or I've done this calculation, there's going to be two key inputs. One's going to be data from the world. And as you mentioned in your introduction, some of that could be survey data. It could be other things as well, though. It could be characteristics of the economy, such as the unemployment rate. It could be the extent to which the U.S. is involved in international affairs, or it could even be about how the public's evaluating the incumbent president, the current approval rating. All of that would be taken as data inputs to the model. Then the model is also going to take some assumptions that could be based on prior elections, or it could be based on things the analyst thinks is possible. For example, what is the plausible polling error in a particular election? And how are those polling errors related across different states? Knowing the answer to that question is key to getting the forecast correct. And as you can imagine, that's very difficult to know.
Are we still in the state of the art where we're tweaking the variables that we plug into these scenarios?
It will depend upon the particular forecast that's being deployed. For example, 538, which Nate Silver no longer runs, now G. Elliott Morris runs that particular model. And midway through the 2024 campaign, he recalibrated the way the model was fitting the data and merging this information, the data and assumptions together to reach the conclusion. Nate Silver makes the claim that he hasn't modified the model much over time, and I think that's borne out. Other election forecasters will make small tweaks, usually long before the election begins, in ways in which they think they'll help their model perform better. But it is the case that sometimes over the course of the election, people will make these tweaks in order to adjust for particular facts or new pieces of information that are available.
My antenna starts to twitch a little bit when you talk about tweaking the model, because I wonder how much you can tweak the model before numbers from different years and different surveys and different scenarios are no longer comparable to each other, don't give you a longitudinal view of a situation.
I think this is an important intuition. Ideally, what we'd have is lots and lots of data where we could say, I don't really have to make a strong assumption here. I can just let the historical record speak for the way I'm going to construct this model. And of course, in any setting, past performance doesn't promise future success. However, we could say, well, the reason I'm making this decision is this is how it's been consistently across many, many prior forecasts that I've made. The unfortunate reality about presidential elections is that we don't have this long track record to guide these sorts of decisions. And as a result of that, we don't have that nice long historical record to really guide these modeling decisions. And that means a well-intentioned analyst, someone who's not trying to bias the results or otherwise come up with results for a particular output, just trying to come up with something reasonable, will be in a position where they have to make these consequential assumptions that will have a profound effect on the determination they make.
I can see the appeal, I really can, of being able to do this. But I'm also a little skeptical because elections are such individual animals. So, yeah, you may say, well, what was the Dow? What was inflation that year? What was unemployment? What's party registration in key states? But there's a sort of X factor that I think is really hard to catch with data science about how people are feeling and what the atmosphere is like, and things that I suspect are pretty hard to quantify, pretty hard to measure in a way that they're easily loaded into a program.
We can look at elections, and we certainly know that historically, some things have a consistent relationship with vote choice. We know the state of the economy, the first or second quarter of a presidential election year can tell us something about how the incumbent party is going to perform in that election. It's not a perfect one-to-one relationship, but there's some relationship there. And so another way to think about what that means is if it's going to be a landslide race, these fundamental characteristics, these long historical relationships will tell us a lot. And even in a close race, they tell us something. We know Wyoming is going to go red and California is going to go blue. But what's important about these recent elections is that they're so close that these fundamentals and even the polls can't resolve this uncertainty that we have. When an election is decided by 40,000 votes across 3 states, you're right. This X factor, the feelings of these independent voters and which candidate they find more appealing or who happens to be mobilized to go to the polls, those things are going to be determinative. And that's very hard for us to model because it is such a small segment of the population and there's so much inherent randomness in whether those things happen.
People who have been listening to our conversation and saying, yeah, oh, no, oh, yeah, let's complicate their lives just a little bit more. In a recent article you wrote for Politico, you said, the reality is there's far less precision and far more punditry than forecasters admit. You arguing against your own models here?
So I would hope not, but I think we should have some clarity with the public about what these models can do. It certainly can be useful to take polling data from many firms and to bring that together, to average those data together. I think that's probably preferable to overreacting to a single poll. And it could be interesting to look at how the current polling compares to polling in prior years. But when forecasters do things like create a probability that says it's 70% chance Clinton's going to win and a 30% chance Trump's going to win, that's not an exercise in precise statistics. That's not an exercise that'll be grounded in data. That is an exercise that's grounded in the very particular assumptions of their model. And really, what's interesting is that different assumptions that they could have made in their model would move that probability around a lot. In fact, in this current election, we're seeing this right now, where Nate Silver's model, which based on a purely statistical basis, if you were to say, look at this model, one would say that's probably very reasonable. And if you were to look at G. Elliott Morris's model at 538, you'd say that's also probably a very reasonable model. And yet they reach different conclusions about who's ahead in the race, and they have very different probabilities about who's ahead. And that sort of fundamental uncertainty is what I have in mind.
So is this more useful if, as a tool, we take a look at it as telling us something about momentum and trends, and not necessarily absolute precision in its portrait of the electorate?
Yeah, I think the most ideal use of this technology would be to assess things like the current state of the polls. What are the average of the polls saying? Where it becomes much less useful are prognostications about the probability of someone winning, or even more extreme, the probability of a candidate winning the Electoral College but losing the popular vote, or the probability of a tie in the Electoral College. Those calculations are all very strongly dependent upon the model and not grounded in any sort of reality that I think the public should or even could rely upon.
But if there's a data set run in May and it gives somebody a 58% chance, and then another one run in July that shows 60, and another one run in September that shows 62, while the particular numbers themselves may be more or less on the nose, there is something that you can learn from looking at that, right?
I think you would hope. Let me just tell you how we would evaluate that in a forecasting setting that's not an election. So if we were evaluating a machine learning model and we had a model that said 58% of the time, someone's going to click on this ad, which is a very common thing that you'll try to do with a forecasting model. What we would see is if it were the case that we deployed the ad 100 times, 58 times out of 100, someone clicked on that ad. If we find that, then the model is calibrated. And if we have a model that's well calibrated, these percentages match up to the frequency of behavior we're forecasting, then we'd say this trend in the polls makes a lot of sense, and it looks like something's changing in the race. The problem is we don't know how well calibrated these forecasting models are.
Are people in this still developing industry caught a little wrong-footed by the fact that this is such a novel year, given the departure of the incumbent and the nominee, the all but certain nominee of the party, as late as it happened in the game, that a lot of the things that you might otherwise model and assume from other campaigns and from this year are just invalid or don't match up very well?
That's part of the art and the challenge of forecasting. And we think about evaluating these models. We won't know until after the fact. We can tell the story now that this is an election unlike any other. I mean, for goodness sakes, one candidate had an assassination attempt, nearly died shortly after another candidate dropped out. We could say that this is completely bespoke and we can't use these models. On the other hand, maybe it's the case that the public has a short attention span, and really this campaign's going to fall into a pretty standard campaign dynamic where people who vote for Democrats will vote for Democrats, Republicans for Republicans, and it'll come down to mobilization and the small number of swing voters. It's really hard to know, and that itself would be a forecast that's hard to make.
Does the applicability of the model increase as Election Day draws closer?
Again, it would be appealing if
Just the fact that I give you pause with that question is telling me something.
ideally what we'd be able to do is we have lots and lots of election outcomes, and we know how much better we're getting as elections day gets closer. I think it is the case that as election day gets closer, it becomes clear some states will be in play or not. So that's important. But if we're focused on something like picking the winner, the fundamental problem is going to be in these recent presidential elections that there'll be a small set of states that are going to be decided by a very small set of votes. And that margin is so small that even running lots of polls or having deep insight into how factors will be affecting vote choices won't be enough to resolve the uncertainty in who's going to win those states.
In some ways, this presumes to be a world of disinterestedness and rationality and arm's length assessment. And I'm wondering whether, when the data is inconclusive or points to several different scenarios, the act of interpretation comes in.
There's certainly a temptation from the public to view a lot of forecasts this way as well. So in recent weeks, Nate Silver has taken a lot of criticism from folks on the left because they say his forecast is biased in inappropriate ways towards Trump. And the folks that have been offering this criticism spin some conspiracy about this has to do with Silver's involvement with betting markets and various pro-Trump people. I think there's a few ways in which these criticisms are misguided. One is that many of these decisions are intentionally made long before we know what the data will look like. So we talked about tweaking the models a little bit earlier. If you can minimize the amount of tweaking that you'll make available, you're going to make decisions when they're in a dispassionate place. You won't know what could possibly bias your model to favor one candidate or the other. The second thing I'd say is the hope would be that at some point we'll have enough data to evaluate this, and that would work against you. You would say, usually in forecasting, you could have whatever biases you want. We'll have reality is going to intervene and we'll know if you're biased. The unfortunate thing about elections, however, is that we're just really not going to get enough of those data points. We're not going to see enough election results for someone who was biased to pay a price. And that's all the more true because, as you've noted, every election things are a little bit different. And so it's hard to imagine that the same accuracy you had in 2016 would be your accuracy in 2024. And so it's easy to say, oh, I was biased, I missed, I'm making a probabilistic forecast. And so that does help people evade accountability a bit.
When we turn the conversation from forecasting models to betting marketplaces, are we talking about a very different beast? And does the public's impression of one poison the other?
Yeah, betting markets are very interesting. We evaluate them a bit in a paper that we wrote, and you end up reaching a very similar conclusion to evaluate whether aggregating information in a betting market where individuals are purchasing contracts that either Trump or Harris will win, and those contracts will resolve for $1 for every person who purchased the Trump contract and $1 for every person who purchased the Harris contract. The hope would be that that aggregates up a lot of information and would pay a penalty for having these biases. If you have a pro-Trump bias, you will directly lose money in the betting market, is the hope. The problem, of course, in these markets is, first, they're not always subject to lots of money being involved. So people will do this for fun. They'll say, oh, I'm going to go buy some contracts for fun. And as a result of that, maybe they're not reflecting the current state of this information. But there is some evidence that individuals who used forecasts from, say, 538, for example, could do better in the betting markets, which would suggest that there is some money kicking around in these markets that's not smart money. It's not money that's following all the information, because 538 forecast and investing based on that could do a little bit better. You know, just to portray the hope of what a betting market is, I think that people think that there'll be such a financial incentive to resolve our uncertainty about this election that individuals would go out and acquire as much information as they could in order to make the right contract purchase, in order to make money.
What should my business be doing? I think, writ large, we have sometimes been very misleading about what forecasting models and what the latest polls have to tell us. Is there a way that we could be reporting this that might be more useful and, of course, more accurate to the listening public?
Yes. So one of the big pieces of advice that comes from this line of research is that we should avoid articulating probabilities because those are so easily confused for vote shares. People very easily will confuse the 80% chance of winning with an 80% vote share, and that can lead to a real problem and even depressed turnout. But more to the point, I think it's fine to present polling averages or to give a state of the race as far as choices, but we shouldn't portray that we have some deep insight into what's going to happen or even how much uncertainty we have about what's going to happen. We know what the polling averages are now, and we know where the candidates tell us they think the race is close and where they'll be expending effort. But the anxiety that goes along with the presidential campaign is going to be there for everybody. And we can't get rid of that anxiety with these forecasting models. Instead, we can just report what the candidates are doing and encourage people who are feeling anxious to participate in the political process.
One election forecaster, maybe tongue-in-cheek, maybe not, said, well, we're probably better than dart-throwing monkeys. Are we?
It really depends on what we're evaluating. If we wanted to say, are election forecasters better than a dart throwing monkey at picking state winners? That's certainly true. Many other people are good at that. I think, a well-informed observer of American politics can pick the way most states are going to go. The thing that's challenging is if we were to say they're better than this random monkey or random just other forecaster at picking the national winner, that's a thing we just don't know. And I think forecasters want to say, well, we make all of these other forecasts. We should get credit for those. But the thing that's challenging is that there are some people who claim to be very good at forecasting, who only forecast the US presidential election. And I think some of these probabilistic forecasters try to dismiss those forecasts, but they're still there and viable. And the people who make them think they're very accurate. And so it's important to note that we need lots more information in order to make that distinction.
That's Justin Grimmer. He's co-author of the book Text as Data, a new framework for machine learning and the social sciences. Great to talk to you.
Great talking with you. Thank you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Sienna Barnes, Elise Manukian, and Matteo Schimpf. A special thanks to Holly Hart from KICI in Iowa City. The program was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.